The pulsating heart of the city seemed relentless, its cacophony now a familiar backdrop to our lives. Mark and I, having succumbed to the monotonous drone of urban existence, found ourselves yearning for an escape. When Mark discovered the advertisement for a cabin in Croftwood Village, Maine, tucked away in a travel magazine tucked under a coffee shop table, it felt like fate. The photographs boasted of an enchanting retreat, encased in the lush embrace of nature, promising serenity at an unbelievably low price. We were enticed, envisioning a peaceful hiatus from our demanding city lives. We spent the subsequent days planning our escape with the zeal of treasure hunters on the brink of unearthing something monumental. Maps were spread across the living room floor, surrounded by various travel guides and hastily scribbled notes on tourist spots and hiking trails. But as the departure day dawned, our anticipation was tinged with a hint of unease, almost imperceptible against the backdrop of excitement. That morning we loaded our modest hatchback with everything we thought we'd need for the week: clothing, food supplies, a couple of old but reliable sleeping bags, and, despite my reservations, an ancient tent just in case the cabin failed to meet Mark's optimistic expectations. The city bade us a boisterous farewell, its sounds slowly diminishing as we drove into the sprawling countryside. The transition was remarkable. Skyscrapers were replaced by towering trees, and the staccato of honking cars gave way to the melodious chirping of birds. The further we drove, the more the urban clutter was replaced by the vibrant colors of fall. Red, orange, and yellow leaves danced in the crisp wind, creating a kaleidoscope of colors that flickered in the sunlight filtering through the canopy above. However, as we neared Croftwood Village, a dense fog began to creep across the landscape, swallowing the vibrant hues and replacing them with a monochrome palette of greys and whites. Our cheerful chatter dwindled into silence as the GPS signal flickered out, leaving us to rely solely on an old map and Mark's notoriously questionable sense of direction. "We're not lost," Mark asserted, more to convince himself than me, as he squinted at the map. "The village should be right around this bend." Sure enough, as we rounded a particularly dense thicket of trees, a weathered sign greeted us. "Welcome to Croftwood Village, established 1789, it declared, standing lopsided at the edge of a narrow, cobblestone road that led deeper into an oppressive fog. The village, hidden until now by the fog and the forests, seemed to materialize out of nowhere. As we drove through the main street, it was clear that Croftwood Village was clinging to the past. Buildings that once might have been quaint were now mostly derelict, their wooden facades battered by the elements and time. There wasn't a soul in sight, and the only sounds were the gravel crunching under our tires and the eerie creaking of old signboards swaying in the gentle wind. Our destination, the cabin, stood on the outskirts of the village, isolated and seemingly forgotten. The advertisement's photographs had done it a generous service. In reality, the cabin was more akin to a shack, with peeling paint and windows grimy with the dust of disuse. It stood alone in a small clearing, surrounded by encroaching woods that seemed to watch and whisper among themselves. Mark, ever the optimist, parked the car and clapped his hands together, a grin spreading across his face. "Here we are. It's perfect, isn't it? Just needs a little sprucing up, and it'll be as good as new." I wasn't convinced. The cabin had an aura of desolation, and the heavy silence seemed laden with unspoken stories. As we unloaded the car, the fog seemed to close in around us, like a cold embrace from the forest itself. It felt as though we had not found Croftwood Village by chance, but rather it had invited us in, luring us into its forgotten history, eager to make itself remembered. As we stepped out of the car, the air felt unusually crisp, the kind of freshness that whispered of untouched wilderness and hidden depths. Mark's enthusiasm seemed undeterred by the thick fog that continued to blanket everything in a ghostly shroud. He hefted our bags over his shoulder with a cheer that seemed out of place in the gloomy surroundings. "Come on, it's just a bit of mist," he said, flashing a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Adds to the atmosphere, doesn't it?" I followed him, my steps hesitant as I glanced around the clearing. The cabin stood like a silent sentinel in the midst of encroaching woods, its windows dark and unwelcoming. As we approached, the reality of our accommodation sunk in further. The wood of the porch groaned under our weight, a sound that seemed to echo into the quiet around us. The door was slightly ajar, creaking ominously as Mark pushed it open. Inside, the cabin was dimly lit by the weak sunlight that managed to pierce through the dirty windows. Dust particles floated in the air, visible in the narrow beams of light. The interior smelled of mildew and decay, a stark contrast to the crisp air outside. A small living area with a rusted, unused fireplace suggested that it had once been a cozy setting, perhaps even charming in a rustic way. But now, it just felt abandoned and forlorn. "Looks like no one's been here in years," I murmured, running a finger along a dusty tabletop, leaving a clear streak on the surface. Mark was already exploring the small kitchen area, opening cupboards that squeaked on their hinges. "It's got character," he insisted, though his voice lacked its usual conviction. "A bit of cleaning, and it'll be great. You'll see." We spent the next couple of hours airing out the rooms and attempting to tidy up the best we could. The utilities were surprisingly still functional, with running water that coughed and sputtered to life, and an old gas stove that lit with a hesitant flicker. We arranged our groceries in the tiny refrigerator and set up our sleeping bags in the only bedroom, which featured a dusty mattress that we decided to avoid. As the sun began to set, the fog outside grew even thicker, if possible, swallowing up the dwindling light and casting everything into shadows. The silence of Croftwood Village felt deeper now, more profound, as if even the animals had decided to steer clear of this place. "I'm going to check if I can get any signal on the ridge nearby," Mark announced after dinner, which consisted of canned soup heated over the stove. "Maybe we can find out more about this place." "Be careful," I cautioned, a knot of anxiety tightening in my stomach. "It's easy to get lost in this fog." Mark nodded, grabbing a flashlight. "I won't go far, just to the edge of the clearing. See if I can get a bar or two." Left alone, I decided to explore the cabin a bit more. There was a small bookshelf in the corner of the living room, crammed with old, musty books. As I scanned the titles, I noticed that many were about local history or folklore, their covers worn and pages yellowed with age. Curiosity piqued, I pulled out a volume titled Legends of the Northeast Woods and flipped through it. The book fell open to a chapter about ghostly apparitions and unexplained phenomena in areas much like Croftwood. It spoke of settlers who vanished without a trace, eerie lights seen in the woods at night, and chilling accounts of encounters with spectral figures. The stories were unsettling, casting a new light on the quaint, historical allure that small villages like this one often held. I was so engrossed in the book that I didn't hear Mark return. He appeared beside me suddenly, causing me to jump. "Anything interesting?" he asked, noticing the book in my hands. "Just some local legends," I replied, trying to sound nonchalant. "Ghost stories and folklore, mostly." Mark raised an eyebrow. "Spooky. Perfect for the setting, though, huh?" "Yeah, perfect," I said, but the word felt hollow. The book had stirred something, a nagging sense of unease that I couldn't shake off. We decided to turn in early, the exhaustion of the day weighing on us. As I nestled into my sleeping bag, the wind began to howl outside, a mournful sound that seemed to carry with it the whispers of the past. The trees rustled, and somewhere in the distance a branch snapped. Sleep proved elusive. The sounds of the night seemed magnified, and each creak and moan of the cabin's settling frame tightened the knot of dread in my belly. It was as if the very air around us was charged with a silent warning, one that whispered of forgotten things best left undisturbed. As the night deepened around Croftwood Village, the air grew colder, pressing against the thin walls of our cabin with the persistence of an unwelcome visitor. Mark had fallen asleep quickly, his breaths even and deep, unaffected by the eerie chorus of the wind and creaking wood. I lay awake, wrapped tightly in my sleeping bag, listening to the haunting symphony of the old cabin nestled within the whispering woods. The moon was a mere sliver in the sky, barely casting its silvery glow through the grimy windows, leaving most of the room bathed in shadows. Each shadow seemed to pulse with a life of its own, stretching and contracting as if breathing. The subtle movements played tricks on my eyes, making me see forms and figures that weren't really there, or so I hoped. Suddenly, a soft noise broke through the rhythmic pattern of the wind. At first, I thought it might be just another voice of the old cabin settling into the earth a little deeper. But then it came again, a whisper, not the whisper of wind through the leaves, but something clearer, more articulate. It was a hushed murmur, a string of syllables that seemed to call out from the darkness outside. I held my breath, trying to discern any words, but it was like listening to a conversation muffled by thick walls. The whispers grew, a soft crescendo that prickled the skin at the back of my neck. I sat up, peering into the darkness, half expecting to see someone standing at the foot of my sleeping bag. But there was nothing, only the dense blackness of a room lit by neither lamp nor moonlight. Compelled by a mix of fear and curiosity, I reached out and shook Mark gently. He grumbled in protest, swatting the air as if to bat away an annoying insect. "Mark," I hissed, my voice low, "do you hear that?" He mumbled something incoherent and rolled over, clearly undisturbed. But the sound didn't cease. It seemed to surround the cabin, enveloping it in a cocoon of soft, unintelligible chatters. With a deep breath to steady my nerves, I crept out of my sleeping bag and tiptoed to the window, peering out into the fog that hung like a curtain over the night. The moon, obscured by thick clouds, offered little illumination, yet my eyes gradually adjusted to the darkness. At first, all I could make out were the shapes of trees swaying in the breeze. But then something moved, a shadow, distinct from the swaying branches. It flitted between the trees, now here, now gone, as if mocking my attempts to pinpoint its location. Heart-pounding, I watched, frozen, as the whispers seemed to grow in intensity. They were louder now, no longer just murmurs but clear, distinct voices. They spoke in a cadence that was almost musical, an ebb and flow that felt both alien and familiar. Then, as sudden as a blink, silence fell. The whispers cut off, as if someone had pressed pause on the world. The abruptness of the quiet was more terrifying than the whispers had been. My gaze still fixed on the trees, I held my breath, waiting for something, anything, to happen. That's when the tapping began. It was soft at first, so faint I thought I might have imagined it. 3 slow, deliberate taps on the window pane behind me. I turned slowly, my heart thudding painfully against my ribs. The tapping paused, and then it came again. Tap, tap, tap. Gathering every ounce of courage, I inched toward the window, my hands trembling as I pulled back the curtain just a sliver. The glass was cold against my fingertips, fogged from the inside by our breath, yet clear enough that I should have been able to see anyone, or anything, standing outside. But there was nothing, only the oppressive fog, swirling as if it were alive, dancing to the rhythm of some unseen conductor. I stared into it, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. Was I losing my grip on reality, succumbing to the stress and isolation of this place? As I stood there, a new sound cut through the night, a shriek high and sharp, piercing the fog like a knife. It was a fox, I told myself, trying to calm my racing heart. Just a fox. Yet the cabin no longer felt safe, no longer felt like a simple rustic retreat. It felt alive, watchful, and filled with whispers of its past. As I crawled back into my sleeping bag, The whispers resumed, a soft lullaby that seemed both a warning and a welcome. Sleep eventually claimed me, but it was fitful, filled with dreams of shadowy figures moving silently through the mist, their eyes watching, always watching. Morning light did little to dispel the shadows that had settled in my mind from the previous night. As I stirred from a restless slumber, the cabin felt colder, as if the night's eerie occurrences had seeped into the wooden beams and stone foundation, chilling its very essence. Mark was already up, his face a mask of concern as he brewed coffee on the old stove. The strong, earthy scent of the brew did little to comfort me. "You look like you saw a ghost," he commented with a weak attempt at humor as he handed me a steaming cup. "I didn't see anything," I replied, the memory of the whispers and taps causing a shiver to run down my spine. "But I heard them, voices and tapping on the window. It wasn't just the wind." Mark's expression sobered. He sat down across from me, his elbows on the kitchen table. "I heard them too, after I went outside. It was all around, whispers, like they were talking right next to me. But whenever I turned, there was nothing there, just fog and darkness." We sipped our coffee in silence, each lost in our thoughts. The rational part of my mind wanted to dismiss our experiences as the product of isolation and an overactive imagination, but the fear I felt was palpably real. Determined to shake off the unease, we decided to explore the village in daylight. Perhaps understanding our surroundings would dispel the shadows of the night. The fog had lifted slightly, allowing us a clearer view of Croftwood Village. The houses we passed were relics of a bygone era, their structures warped and worn by time. Many were abandoned, their windows boarded up, creating a ghost town atmosphere. As we walked, we noticed the village wasn't entirely deserted. Here and there signs of life peeked through, a curtain twitching, smoke rising from a chimney. Yet it seemed as though the inhabitants were deliberately avoiding us, enhancing the village's eerie solitude. The center of the village hosted an old church with a steeple that pierced the sky. Its doors were surprisingly well maintained compared to the dilapidation around it. Curiosity drew us to it, and as we approached, the front doors creaked open as if welcoming us, or warning us to stay away. Inside, the church was dimly lit by sunlight filtering through stained glass windows. Dust motes danced in the beams of light, and the pews were coated in a thick layer of dust. There was an oppressive feel to the air, heavy with the scent of mildew and decay. At the altar, a set of candles burned, their flames flickering as though disturbed by our presence. We walked down the aisle, our footsteps echoing off the high ceilings, creating whispers of their own. At the altar, a book lay open on a lectern, its pages yellowed with age. It was a register of the villagers, names and dates going back centuries. The most recent entries were from over 50 years ago, and abruptly they stopped. As Mark traced his fingers over the names, a cold breeze swept through the church, extinguishing the candles with a hiss. The sudden darkness enveloped us, and for a moment we were statues, frozen by the chilling shift. "Let's get out of here," I whispered, my voice sounding loud in the sudden silence that followed the snuffing of the candles. We hurried back to the sunlight, the church doors slamming shut behind us with a bang that sent birds scattering from the trees overhead. The sense of being watched, which had momentarily subsided, returned with greater intensity as we left the church grounds. The rest of our exploration was underlined by a sense of urgency. We passed the village well, its structure covered in vines, and a schoolhouse with broken windows, the playground overtaken by weeds. Everywhere we went, the sensation of being followed persisted, as if the village itself was aware of our every step. Returning to the cabin as the sun began its descent, the feeling of dread grew. We were no longer just visitors. We had stirred something in Croftwood, something that watched and waited with the patience of the ages. As dusk turned to night, we prepared for another evening in the cabin. Armed with more candles and flashlights, Determined not to be left in the dark again, we tried to fortify ourselves against the unknown. But as the darkness grew thicker outside, so did the fog, enveloping the cabin once more in its cold embrace. The whispers began again as night fully settled in. This time they were louder, more insistent. Shadows flickered at the edges of the light cast by our candles, shapes that seemed almost human, twisted and elongated by the flickering flames. Then the tapping resumed, more forceful than the night before. It was accompanied by a chilling draught that swept through the cabin, snuffing out candles and leaving us in near total darkness. The flashlight's beam trembled in Mark's hand as we heard what sounded like footsteps, the slow, deliberate steps of someone or something circling the cabin. Paralyzed by fear, we huddled together, listening as the steps stopped right outside the door. There was a pause, a silence so deep it felt like the world was holding its breath. Then, very slowly, the doorknob turned. The doorknob turned with agonizing slowness, its creaks a harrowing melody that seemed to play with deliberate intention. My breath caught in my throat, my body frozen in place next to Mark, who was clutching the flashlight like a lifeline. The beam of light shook, casting erratic shadows across the cabin's rustic interior, making the modest room feel like the stage of some macabre play. With a final, ominous click, the door swung open. The cold air that rushed in was like a wave from the depths of the ocean, chilling and damp, smelling faintly of earth and decay. The open doorway revealed nothing but the thick, impenetrable fog that seemed to press eagerly into the cabin, as if it had been waiting for an invitation. Mark and I exchanged a glance, a silent agreement passing between us in the dim light. He edged forward, the flashlight's beam cutting a path through the darkness. I followed closely, each step tentative as we approached the threshold of the cabin. Peering out into the fog, there was no sign of what might have opened the door. The night was eerily silent now, the whispers and footsteps having ceased abruptly with the door's opening. "Hello!" Mark's voice was barely above a whisper, his usual bravado diminished by the night's eerie events. There was no response. The fog seemed to swallow the sound, muffling it effectively. We retreated back inside, the door shut firmly and locked, though the gesture felt utterly futile against whatever had been toying with us. Back in the center of the room, we set up a small perimeter with our remaining candles and the flashlight. The light created a small oasis in the darkness, a fragile bubble of safety that felt both comforting and terrifyingly fragile. As the hours crept by, the isolation of the cabin became oppressive, every small noise amplified by the silence outside. Our conversation dwindled to nothing. What was there to say that could make any difference in the face of our inexplicable reality? Then, without warning, the tapping started again. It was different this time, purposeful and rhythmic, a pattern that repeated itself. 3 taps, a pause, then 3 more. It encircled the cabin, moving from window to window, a predator stalking its prey. Mark rose, his movements sharp and quick, as he attempted to trace the sound's origin through the windows. "It's circling us," he murmured, his voice tight with fear. The flashlight followed his gaze, the beam flickering slightly as if it too were afraid of what it might reveal. I pulled the book of local legends closer to me, flipping through the pages in a desperate search for anything that might help. My hands trembled as I read about spirits of the land disturbed by the living, about echoes of the past that refused to fade into obscurity. The folklore spoke of rituals and appeasements, of respect and understanding for the forces that governed these hidden places. But nothing I read offered any practical advice on what to do when confronted by such forces. As dawn approached, the tapping gradually subsided, but the sense of dread lingered. We were trapped in a loop of fear and confusion, every sound a potential threat, every shadow a potential enemy. The cabin felt no longer like a shelter but a trap, expertly designed to isolate and terrorize. Exhausted by the night's events, we eventually succumbed to a restless sleep, filled with nightmares that played out like scenes from the stories in the old book. We were wanderers in a forgotten world, chased by unseen forces that knew our every thought, our every fear. When we awoke, the cabin was silent, the oppressive atmosphere of the night replaced by the muted sounds of a world waking up outside. The door remained closed, the windows fogged over with the remnants of the night's mist. It seemed impossible that the serene light of morning could penetrate such darkness as we had experienced. Determined to leave, we packed our belongings with shaking hands, the memory of the night's terror fresh in our minds. As we loaded the car, the village seemed to watch us go, the fog lingering like a final warning. The drive back through the woods was silent, each of us lost in our thoughts, processing the events we could neither explain nor understand fully. Croftwood Village had changed us, had shown us the depth of the unknown, and left its mark upon our souls. As the village faded into the distance, swallowed up once more by the fog, a chilling thought crossed my mind. Were we truly leaving, or were we merely playing our part in a story that was far from over? As we navigated away from Croftwood Village, the fog seemed to cling to the car, swirling with an almost palpable reluctance to let us go. The silence between Mark and me was heavy, laden with unspoken fears and the echo of eerie whispers that still seemed to find us even as we sped along the forest-lined road. Eventually, the road began to clear, the oppressive fog thinning as we reached the outskirts of the village. The normalcy of the sunlit landscape beyond Croftwood's boundaries was disorienting, as if we were emerging from one world into another entirely. Yet the relief of escaping the village's eerie embrace was overshadowed by the lingering dread that what we had experienced would forever haunt the edges of our reality. We didn't speak much on the drive back to the city. Each of us was trapped in our own reflections, attempting to dissect the events we'd endured. Every shadow cast by a passing cloud, every rustle of leaves in the breeze seemed to whisper back to those moments surrounded by the unknown. Upon our return, the city felt jarringly loud and vibrant. The mundane sights of urban life, crowded streets, towering buildings, and the incessant flow of people, felt alien after our ordeal. We parted ways with a brief, uneasy goodbye, the kind that acknowledged that something fundamental in our friendship had shifted. I found myself unable to step back into my routine. Nights were the worst. The silence of my apartment was too reminiscent of the quiet that had pervaded the cabin just before the whispers began. Sleep was elusive, and when it came, it was fitful and filled with nightmares of shadowy figures tapping at my window. Driven by a need for answers, I decided to visit the local library to research more about Croftwood Village. Buried in old newspaper archives, I found fleeting references to the village. There were reports dating back to the early 1900s about disappearances, strange sightings, and unexplained phenomena similar to what we had experienced. One article from the 1950s detailed a mass exodus from the village, with residents citing ghostly apparitions and an unbearable sense of dread. The most chilling piece was an old journal entry from a librarian in a neighboring town who wrote about Croftwood. The land there is sour. The village is cursed by something ancient that refuses to let go of its hold. Those who leave feel its call forevermore. I continued my research, diving deeper into historical records and local folklore. I learned about the land's original inhabitants, an indigenous tribe known for its deep spiritual connection to the forest. They believed in spirits of nature that protected the land but also demanded respect and reverence. The village's construction had disrupted sacred sites, leading to a series of tragic events and, eventually, abandonment. This knowledge brought little comfort. If anything, it intensified the weight of what we'd encountered. I had to know if Mark felt the same haunting pull, so I called him, half expecting him not to answer. When he did, his voice was strained but relieved to hear from me. "Do you feel it too?" was the first thing he asked, his tone urgent. "The weight of it, yes. It's like we're still there, isn't it? Like we never really left," I replied. We met up, spending hours talking about our experiences, trying to piece together the fragments of our memories. It was clear that whatever resided in Croftwood didn't intend to let us go entirely. The realization was a cold comfort. It wasn't just the physical place of Croftwood that haunted us. It was the village's sorrow, its ancient guardians, and its unresolved past. Determined to find some semblance of closure, we agreed to return to Croftwood, to face the lingering spirits and perhaps appease them. We researched rituals of respect and offering, preparing ourselves to confront the village's ghosts with reverence rather than fear. When we returned, the village was as we remembered, shrouded in fog, silent except for the whispers of the wind. We performed the rituals at the heart of the village, offering tokens of respect and speaking words of peace. As we did, the air shifted, the fog seeming to lift slightly, the oppressive weight easing. As we left Croftwood Village for the second time, the whispers didn't follow. The road home was clearer, the grip of the village loosening. Whether it was our actions or simply the passage of time, we felt a chapter close. Yet, in the back of my mind, the echoes of Croftwood whispered still, a haunting melody that would remain a part of us, forever ingrained in the fabric of our beings.